Good morning. I'll be giving an overview in regards to systems barriers and socioeconomic mobility lessons from the field. In July 2020, the Alliance hosted a series of virtual community conversations with community leaders across the country, creating space for people to share strategies, successes, and challenges in their work to address the root causes of poverty. Several common themes emerged over the series of discussions with nearly 100 individuals representing community organizations, schools, public agencies, and healthcare. The conversations made clear that sustainable solutions will require significant shifts in how we think about and implement socioeconomic mobility efforts. This workshop will focus on the 6 major themes surfaced in the community conversations, highlighting both the entrenched systemic challenges that human services organizations face in their anti-poverty work, as well as core strategies and promising practices. The discussion will include stories of how organizations are centering racial equity in anti-poverty work, considering their employees' socioeconomic well-being, and addressing misconceptions and competition in their regional environments. Participants will engage in small group discussion and application to consider the system's challenges in their work and to identify leverage points for future action. And now I'll introduce to you guys our 2 speakers, Jerica Broecklin, Director of Jerica Broecklin Advising, and Phyllis Richards, Director of EDI and Research.
So I'm Jerica Broecklin. I am an independent consultant, and I do an extensive amount of work with my colleague Phyllis Richards here at what is up until last week known as the Alliance for Strong Families and Communities in COA, and today is known as Social Current, so forgive the lack of current branding here. I want to do a little overview of how we're going to spend our time today with our agenda. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this work from a broad lens, thinking about what systems mean, how do we understand the work that we're doing from that broader lens of systems change, and why do we find ourselves in the challenges we find ourselves in. Phyllis is then going to share how we approach the work that we did that led to the research that she's going to dive into. And then we'll talk a little bit about this work from the space of solutions. So when we understand systems and understand systems thinking, what are the opportunities that come for us to actually implement change from all levels of our ability to engage with the system? And then as time allows, we'll have some space for discussion and Q&A. So we want to start by thinking about social challenges through a systems lens. When we think about systems, we can think about the terminology that we always use. We understand that systems are all around us. We talk about systems change, but we don't always think about systems in terms of models and concepts. So the context for this conversation that we want to have is that we want to think about system as a model for how we understand challenges. It can give us some unique insight. It's never going to give us all of reality or help us understand everything. A system shapes the way we understand and look at the world, but it doesn't describe reality perfectly. We know this as practitioners, especially when we think about working in multiple systems, trying to support individuals who are facing numerous challenges, numerous barriers in systems. We know that those problems are interconnected, that systems are overlapping, and that the problems and challenges that people face, one system doesn't always understand what's happening or work together with a different system. But the challenge is, you can go to the next slide, thank you, is that when we think about systems in terms of solutions, we forget those problems. We tend to apply very common mental errors that our brain helps us set up because they help us understand these challenges better. We're often taught to break down a complex problem and to simplify it. to make, find the most common denominator and to build a solution off of that. We apply linear thinking in terms of saying, if this is the problem, I'll apply a program, and then we're going to get to the solution. We know that that is usually not how families work. That's not how individual lives work, but that's how we're taught to create solutions. So linear thinking is a really common error that we put in. We also have a lot of confusion over cause and effect. So this comes down to how we think about the problem. We assign the cause of the problem based on how we understand it, but rather than the data. Rather than what the data is showing us is the cause of a problem, we may assign a problem like poverty to individual challenges rather than looking at larger systems barriers. And when we do that, the solutions that we create are then going to be applying to individuals and completely ignore all of the systems barriers that we look at. And so when we look at so many different solutions that are out there in the social system and the work that we do, many of them are focused on the wrong side of the problem. They're focused on the individuals rather than fixing the systems problems that are creating these challenges in the first place. When we also think about these problems, we know that life is complex. We know parents have children and they're trying to get to work and they're trying to get an education and they're trying to keep a job, and they may be trying to deal with child welfare or with juvenile justice or with numerous other systems. When we are thinking about solutions, though, we tend to focus only on one. I'm going to focus on early childhood, or I'm going to focus on K-12 education, or just workforce readiness. When we look at that sort of bounded awareness, we're narrowing our scope artificially, and the solutions that we create tend to not interact or take acknowledgement of the other challenges that people face in their everyday lives. People don't live their lives in one system at a time. And so finally, the last problem that we have, or one of the last problems that we have, is that we believe our understanding, our map of this model is the correct one, and that it contains everything that we need to understand the problem. And so when we talk about solutions with others, rather than expanding our thinking or opening our space to create multiple kinds of solutions, we really focus in and we fight each other over our definition of the problem and over the solution. So in a nutshell, that's why our traditional solutions fail. When we are focused on this single focus of a problem, we end up with quick fixes that make the problem worse or that don't address the problem at all. We are not paying enough attention to the really complex challenges that are going to weigh down really creative solutions because we are not completely understanding the systems that are at play. And so when we think about this work, especially in the space of socioeconomic mobility, which is so complex and takes in so many different factors, we find ourselves really commonly in this trap of applying a traditional solution that does not take into account those deep root causes, our disagreement over what is the root of the problem in the first place. And so we fail to work together to create solutions that are actually going to reach at scale. So I'm going to hand it over. Oh, what if we could do this in a different way? What if we could take a systems approach to solving our problems? So when we think about a systems approach to problem solving, many of us jump to, oh, that's policy change, or that's bringing in new elected officials. Those are really important parts of systems change, but they are not the only thing that we can think about when we think about systems change. So when we think about a systems solution, we can think about stepping back and embracing that complexity, understanding that there are structures in place that are really some of the sources of our challenges, and that if we can understand what those structures are, that gives us much better tools to be able to address the challenges than we might have used before. We also want to have a deep understanding of those mental models. That program is based on your understanding of poverty as an individual problem, or as poverty is related only to K-12 education. If that's your mental model, then I have a better way of understanding how to work with you to create a solution. And finally, what we want to think about in terms of a systems solution is that we are working together to make the system healthier. How would this system work if it was truly helping all people achieve health and well-being, regardless of who they are, where they're born, and all of those factors? So now I'm going to hand it over to Phyllis.
So based on all that, we've had this working relationship with Jerica, and we decided to look at this issue of socioeconomic mobility from a systems lens. And to do that, we first needed to start out by defining what we meant as socioeconomic mobility. Quite often in the literature and different organizations, institutions, they had their own definitions of what that was. And so we had to start with deciding what we think and what we saw in the literature compared to the things that we saw with practitioners, what is actual socioeconomic mobility. So for economic mobility, we define it as engaging with individuals and families to maximize the opportunities to build prosperity within a lifetime and between generations. For social mobility, we define it as creating and supporting meaningful connections between people and community and institutions. And then one other important part of it is individual agency. People need to know that they're able to create their own destiny and make their own trajectory. So we define individual agency as having a sense of control, of say, in the trajectory of one's life and one's community. Next slide. So what do? We did several things to gather data around this issue of socioeconomic mobility. As Jerica talked about in the intro, we did community conversations in July of 2020. They were all virtual. We had 6 conversations on different themes: economic mobility, workforce and employment development, health equity, neuroscience, education, and systematic racism. At the time, we had 85 participants that represented 49 organizations. The Alliance is a network of nonprofit organizations, human serving organizations across the nation. It's a national network. We also did a survey of our network members. And so that garnered responses from 98 organizations. We also had our librarians to do a scholarly research around the topic at socioeconomic mobility. And then within the Alliance, we have different of our colleagues that are focused on different impact areas, is what we call them. So we had them do work on a systems map with Jerica to understand what it means to look at it from health, education, workforce, and other areas. Next slide. And so we came up with this map, how community-based organizations address social and economic mobility across the lifespan. This is not exhaustive, but here's some areas that we thought were really important and that we saw things that worked in early education, in K-12 and college and career path, personal and family economic mobility, workforce and employer development, community and society, and other areas of health and equity that are not on here, but we also had that information as well. I'm going to pass this along to Jerica, who's going to talk to us about this.
So just a side note, where you see SEM, that is socioeconomic mobility. We were working with a funder at the time that uses that acronym SEM rather than just, the longer version, socioeconomic mobility. So just so there's no confusion there. So we created that systems map to help us wrap our brains around what does this mean from the perspective of those human serving organizations? What are all the ways in which they are touching this work in spaces that are not always just about helping someone get a job? Certainly someone getting a job is in there, but when you look at those broader social determinants around all of the aspects that impact someone's social and economic well-being, what does it look like? How do nonprofit organizations really work on this and do it in a way that can impact those larger systems change? So you'll have these slides later and you'll have the opportunity to take a look at what works in that space. So when we think about what do we do with this, how do we take this deep knowledge of systems and what all of those problems are that are happening in our systems, and how do we start to understand it in a way that leads us to solutions? So there's a couple of tools that I want to share with you. One is an iceberg map. When you think about an iceberg map, it's about really driving under the surface to start to understand what is happening beyond just what we're seeing in the headlines today. We get so much information and stimuli around everything that's happening in our society today that, again, we start to forget about those deeper patterns and trends that are happening on issues, even if they're issues that we care about. So yes, it's important to know what's happening today. It's important to know that there's legislation out that supports families with children. It's important to know what's happening in local communities, but we also really need to understand what's been happening over time and why. What are those behavior patterns? What are the trends of behavior? Are we as a society starting to give more support to families with children? Are we starting to support individuals in terms of getting jobs? What are we doing? What are those behavior patterns over time? Then we need to dig even deeper and look at the system structure. So what's influencing those events and those patterns? How do the different system components work together to really relate to each other? And so in this space, we might look at what are the legislation? Who's getting elected? Whose vision for change is resonating with people? How do our different departments of government work together? Do they work together really well, or are there severe roadblocks between them? And we need to understand what those roadblocks are because they are shaping the way that people are able to live their lives. So digging into the system structure helps us to understand some of those pieces that we may not see on a daily basis or that we're not going to get stories about. So we might think of the examples, we see things like changes being made to driver's license laws. And if we dig down, we can start to see the system structures underneath there. What does driver's license law mean? How are behaviors about that changing over time? How do we understand that driver's license impacts somebody's ability not just to get a job, but to get a place to live or to travel freely or to really be able to control their ability to be in a city and to have access to things? There's a lot that driver's licenses are the key to. And then finally at the bottom, thinking about mental models. So that deepest level, what are those assumptions? What are those beliefs and what are those values that we have about the system? And how are those deepest mental models impacting everything that comes above it? Once we start to understand that, then we can have a better understanding of what we do about it. The other tool I want to share briefly is it's a root cause analysis. My friend Frank knows this one very well. He uses it a lot, the 5 whys method. The 5 whys method is a very simple tool that really helps us to uncover root causes and to really start to think about what are those aspects of the issue that are keeping that challenge and causing it to occur. So some tips when you are using this 5 whys method and applying it is we want to think about this in terms of specifics. So it's very easy to start asking why, and then at the bottom, you just end up with systemic racism. We know that that is at the core and that that is holding a lot of our systems challenges in place. But if we use the 5 whys method, we can start to uncover where are we seeing those challenges and in what specific way are they impacting this challenge that we're talking about. So there's an example over here to the side that we're having an organization start to look at how are they starting to understand how staff engage with each other. You might start with a question around or an understanding that, well, folks who work in this department don't feel like they can bring themselves to work. They don't have a sense of belonging in this work. And it happens more in this department than it happens in others. Why is that? Well, the answer might be that staff who are in that department don't engage with other colleagues across different roles and backgrounds. Why is that? The work environment may not allow it. This may not be the answer path, but what is that next specific answer? The work environment doesn't allow it, doesn't have those mechanisms for interaction. That's something people have to do on their own time. Why is that? The program wasn't designed for people to engage with each other. It wasn't designed for staff to have that sense of belonging. So now we've hit at something we can do something about. If we understand that this program isn't designed for that, then we can start to think about how do we redesign the program so that staff can get that sense of belonging and connection to the workplace.
So based on all that and the conversations that we had and the process that we went through, we saw some cross-cutting themes in the conversations and the literature. They fall into 2 categories, one that impacts people and the other one that impacts organizations and system level. The first set that impacts people are addressing systematic racism, supporting employees, and engaging participants. The other set, organizational system level, is talking about data collection and analysis, compensation and funding, and restrictive funding. Next slide. When we looked at a desire to address systematic racism, we saw in the conversations, and what I'm showing you are quotes from our conversations that you can read while I'm talking to you. Progress is being made in raising awareness of systematic racism, but understanding and implementation of racial equity runs a continuum with the organizations. Some organizations are centering on equity, while others are just beginning those conversations. And you can see from the comments, from the quotes, racial equity goes a long way, goes all the way down to economic and political inclusion. There have been a lot of work, but it hasn't gone too far beyond problematic. And also groups are impacted differently, but still impacted by historical trauma. So those are some of the quotes from the conversations that we had talking about systemic racism. The next area affecting people are supporting employees. Organizations face challenges ensuring that their own employees have meaningful wages and pathways to social and economic mobility. Some of them are creating solutions that involve intentional employee development, offering SEM services to their staff, changing organizational policies that limit their direct service to the organization. You can see in the comments the struggle that practitioners had trying to work and make decisions on how to help their own employees. One says we don't have the time and funds to get that professional development. They have to have the ability to climb the ladder. The other says, why do we need X degree for this position? Because that really starts to create a barrier for staff to grow. Beginning to think about our policies and practices and how we hire people and what's the requirements for them, to rethink that instead of traditionally just saying that it requires a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, to really dig into what's necessary, helps to release some of those barriers and be creative in trying to change the trajectory. Next slide. Then we had, as an impact on people, engaging participants in decision-making. We know that from the literature and from conversations, that it's important to get the lived experiences from the people who are actually participants in the program. And how do we do that? Across the board, organizations understood the value of participant voice in creating effective SEM strategies, and they worked to build meaningful feedback. These efforts became more challenging higher in the organization's decision-making process. And others using tools like human-centered design, advisory committees, board participation to to lead and to bring out those community voices, those lived experiences. So you can see here that here's some examples. To convene and get people together, we fundamentally believe that we have to have the ability to make change despite the barriers we approach. And then others said, we need to set the stage for their voices to really matter. The parents are the experts. And that's part of the situation, is making sure that people who have the lived experiences are considered the experts and are needed to be at the table with everyone else. Next slide. In the organization and system level, we talk about three things. The first is the data collection and analysis. So data is a tool for organizations to rely on understanding and track the progress of SEM work. Many are collecting longitudinal data from multiple sources whenever possible. The increased complexity, volume, and variation of data sources is a challenge for nearly everybody, affecting data collection systems, staffing, and relationships with funders. So what happens to most practitioners is, because depending on the funding that they receive, they may be receiving funding from 5 different funding streams. They all have data requirements, all have tracking requirements, and they all inevitably are different than each other. There's no similarity, and that becomes a very complex situation. But then, so we spend so much time on those different data requirements, we can't get down to the real issues. So sometimes organizations that where funders don't allow us or don't fund us to disaggregate the data to see if different marginalized communities are being affected differently. One solution was that one of our organizations just decided, we're going to take this time on our own. We have a data person. We're going to ask that person to disaggregate the data, and we're going to see where the issues are happening in our programs. They saw a couple of different issues with their male program participants compared to the female program participants. But what they did with that is they took that information back to the funder. When they presented the data, they added this extra data. And the funder didn't realize the importance and value of this data. So the next round of funding, they added that into what they were going to require and paid for it. So the funding, even the funding of the data can be challenging for people. This quote I really love: we need to better capture inclusive and resilient focused values. Next slide. Then there was a competition and collaboration. So organizations value collaboration broadly, but they struggle with local and regional environments that have competition deeply embedded. So we had organizations that, even though we were a national organization, we had organizations that actually were close to each other in region. And they talked about how they have to compete against each other for dollars. And what does that mean as far as them trying to collaborate and work together? Well, it's very challenging and difficult. And so that's one of the issues that they found, that they wanted to work together. They wanted to collaborate. They saw it as being more impactful to collaborate, but the competition for dollars, the funders didn't see that how they were pitting each other against each other. And so there was always this kind of having to deal with the realities of funding when there's competition, and really trying to get to the root cause and the result. Some regions have established effective collaborations that making progress and creating continuums of care, and other regions were categorized as lack of trust and unwillingness to work together. Being part of a national network was helpful for them because they didn't feel that pressure. They could be able to learn and share from each other, gather ideas, implement innovation. You sure can.
So one story is coming to mind for me when Phyllis was sharing this data. She said, a lot of funders don't realize how they're pitting folks against each other, and some funders do realize it, and they're doing it intentionally. They're saying, we can only fund one of you, so show me your best. And so that puts folks in a position where folks who should be their partners, and they're really close partners, are now their competitors. And so they're withholding information from each other. They are not partnering together because they don't want to end up in a space where the funder says, oh, we decided they're better than you are. We're not funding your program anymore. And that's very real for many communities. And so we heard of a couple of different communities, one in North Carolina, one in Texas, where the organizations came together and said, we're not doing this anymore. They can't be the ones who are driving this agenda. We know what works. We know what the challenges are. We know you're fantastic at this. You're great at that. I'm excellent at this. We're going to work together, and the funders can fund us or they cannot fund us. And so when they partnered together, it created a very different space. And in both of those cases, they found funding partners who said, we really love this idea. We're here, we're on board, we're going to support you. It took time. It's not a magic bullet kind of thing, but it was one way that they were really able to address this challenge.
Yeah, and that certainly is something that as a leader and a practitioner, that's something that you have to balance the risk of doing that and be able to have the financial support and backing ahead of time that you can make those decisions about how you're going to use funds that are unrestricted and be able to collaborate with others. And so nonprofits may not be always in that position to do that, but when they are, being able to know that that's something that they can do and an avenue to get to the results. The last area we talked about and we touched upon is restrictive funding, right? A common challenge across the board is that restrictive funding programs that made it difficult for organizations to support families advancing through SEM. Those with multiple funding sources, flexible sources, and partnerships could support broader ranges of family needs, but they were impacted by time and resources required for this strategy. So certain requirements, funding requirements, made it so that certain participants couldn't participate in other areas that they really needed. That the connection between the different services that would have been provided for them would help them get through to economic mobility. But the restrictions that were given from different funders did not line up. And so there was always this trying to be creative and figure out how you can use this program to help this person, where we should send people, how do we connect that? And that was always a problem for the practitioner. How do we help people without just sending them all away or just only helping them in one area, which we know is not the silver bullet. So you see here the comments, we can't do certain things for clients because they aren't funded. They're very much piecemeal. Even though I have access to these services, I can't get them these services because the dollars say that we can't care for them if they're not in the system. So that frustration you hear from restrictive funding. And pass this back over to Jerica.
So the last thing we want to share with you is, so what do we do about this? We've heard a few examples and ways that folks are doing this on a larger scale, starting to identify and work on system solutions. But we also know that each of us has the opportunity to think about where we sit within a system and to think about what we have the ability to do that contributes to a systems level solution. So we think about this in terms of understanding where we are and what are our natural leverage points. Me and myself, where do I work? What's my experience? What's my expertise in? Who do I have relationships with in my workplace, in my community, in all of the aspects of my life? How do I understand all of those networks that I am part of and think about how to leverage them in favor of systems change? So some actions to think about for folks based on where you might be sitting. If you're a program participant, think about how you can elevate your voice and your experience, whether it's in the program that you're part of, whether it's in the organization that you are part of as a program participant, or whether it's in the community. Join coalitions, vote. There are things that you can do with the organization, and there are things that you can do more broadly in the community. If you are program staff, do you have the ability to bring in those participant voices and then listen to them deeply? And what happens? What are your avenues once you've listened? Do you have the ability to make recommendations for those improvements and changes that will support people with their actual lived experience? If you're in a program director role, first, think about design those programs that actually do address root causes and are not just Band-Aids. And think about the programs that have that acknowledgement of other systems and where do they work? What are those engagement points? Join those partnerships. If you have the ability and the authority to do so, partner with others and start to look at this work from a broader systems perspective. If you are in a specifically advocacy role, if you have an administrative or an executive role within an organization, think about advocacy as a really important tool. So identify and advocate for those policies that have people at their center. And then build those coalitions. See what you can do to create that space and support to join coalitions that exist. If one doesn't exist, build a new one. And then everyone. We understand that there are really harmful narratives out there that are even coming back into play now about who's at fault for some of the challenges that we're facing. Why can't I get good service at a restaurant or find things in the store? And we're starting to blame people who were forced home during COVID, that somehow they are the ones to blame. So there's some really damaging narratives that are out there. What can we do within our space and influence to promote that different narrative? We all deserve work. We deserve meaningful work. We deserve to be safe and to be healthy in the workplace. How do we support that competing narrative?
And to that point too, I want to talk to people, encourage people to disrupt that narrative, to not just hear it, but actually disrupt it and change the trajectory of the narrative. We talk about that when we talk about addressing equity and racism, to disrupt and interrupt that narrative and actually speak differently. Some people have not even thought about it, and they assume that the different trends and narratives that we're hearing are really that, or they haven't thought through, as we talked about in the talking about mental models. People have certain mental models already. How do we disrupt that in a normal conversation, one-on-one conversation with people in a group? So but you have to be aware and listening for that. You have to be receptive to understand other people's viewpoints and then be able to disrupt. At this point, we're going to take some time for discussion, and I think Faye's here with some questions.
Thank you for that insightful and informative information that we've just heard you discuss. At this time, we'll have questions and answers. I'm going to first start with the questions that were given to us virtually. The first question is, how do we address the bigger systems that feed smaller systems?
I should take that one. So that's really where, I don't know how to go back on this one. When we think about what we're able to achieve as individuals and what we're able to achieve together, the coalition side of that effort is really where we have to look to be it. That's it. Thank you, Phyllis. That's where we have to look to be able to start to look at those bigger systems. It's through leveraging our network and our contributions as that greater whole that we're going to be able to change those bigger systems. Advocacy, voting, those are all things that even though they're individual actions, they are directly focused at that bigger systems level.
Yeah, definitely. The whole coalition piece is so important. We feel very paralyzed by the larger issue, but getting with you doing your part and then connecting with another coalition that's doing their part will affect change.
Thank you. The next question is a two-part question. First part says, how can human servicing organizations revolutionize their existing programming through systems change, work within their respective organizations? And then the second part is this even a realistic ask considering the dependency on government and philanthropic funding?
Right. So it gets right to the heart of it, right? I mean, we understand that organizations are, in a lot of cases, bound by their funders and what their funding requirements are. We heard that time and time and time and time again. So The realistic aspect also comes with risk. As Phyllis was saying, what are the risks to you if you decide to partner? What are the risks to you if you have a conversation with your funder and say, this isn't working and here's why, and here's what we need to do instead? Are you risking your relationship with your funder? We know that in many of the stories that we heard, I would say the majority of the stories we heard, that conversation led to a really, positive change. But we do want to acknowledge that there's risk.
There definitely is risk in having a good relationship with your funder. And because of the things that happened in the last 18, 20 months, people with funders seem to be more receptive to understand that they need to make a change. There needs to be a change regarding systematic racism. There needs to be a change in funding organizations that are led by BIPOC people. There needs to be a change in funding in general. And how can philanthropy, and also, but there's also government payers that need to make the changes as well. So, but I want to also think that if you're in that position where you're an administrator or a program director, begin to change, to think about how you can do something differently. It doesn't have to be a big thing. It could be a small thing that could have a ripple effect. Maybe it's a different way that we're doing a program, or maybe it's a different way that we have requirements for our participants. Maybe it's just that we decide to have more engagement with the participants and finding out their lived experiences that can lead us to someplace else. Maybe it's about looking for different funders, asking our board to go outside the norm of where we look for funders. There's lots of small steps we can make that make bigger impact.
We know of a program director in Philly who did that. She was funding a program for LGBTQ youth, and the funder said to them one year, "Oh, sorry, we're only going to fund girls now." And so the program director made the really hard decision that we're going to continue to welcome everybody. We understand you're only going to pay for 50% of the folks who come to our program. We're going to fund everybody, and we're going to keep the data, and you're going to change your mind. She said it took 2 years for that funder to come back around and say, okay, everybody's welcome again, we'll pay for everybody. But they held strongly to that knowledge that everyone needed to be part of that program in order to make it successful.
Thank you. Long story short, to piggyback off what they said, sometimes we have to make the change in order to make a change, if that makes sense. You have to make a change. I have to make a change. We have to make the change in order for there to actually be a change sometimes. So now the floor is open to anyone inside the room that has a question pertaining to the discussion that we all tuned into.
Great presentation, Phyllis and Jerica. You talked about using some systems thinking tools with your staff. Do you have any hints about how to introduce those tools? Because for most of us, this is a different, really a new way of thinking.
I can start. That's such a great question, Frank. It's something that I'm constantly working through and thinking about how to introduce this. My sense is that when I share the Iceberg model and the 5 Whys model, they feel very intuitive to folks. They seem to make sense. And then when we get into it and we start practicing it, people see how hard it is. They see that they're not really, that muscle isn't there to start answering those questions. And so I try to go about doing it very intentionally to say, take some intentional time to pause and to practice this and to do it in conversation with each other and see where you get. Because chances are you're going to have different conversations with each other than you usually do when you're talking about this program or this challenge, because we go to the problem that we always talk about, the issue that we always say is the main issue. This conversation gives us an opportunity to have a different discussion.
I think that practitioners, we're taught to think a certain way. We're taught to, how do I solve it by doing a program? How do I solve it by these different areas? And so having more knowledge about what does it mean to do, to look at it from that system lens, taking on an online class or having, being part of a collective impact, where they're using systems viewpoints, learning about systems mapping. As leaders, we could do those things and begin to, as Jerica said, to slowly, intentionally have that part of our conversations, that when we have conversations about, here's an issue, someone stepping out and said, let's talk about from the 5 whys. Let's just do that conversation and find out. It is challenging and difficult because we want to race to the solution. It is difficult in that it's a longer term solution too, right? It's not immediate, but so much of the programs that we have are all downstream. They're not upstream responses to an issue that we need. And we're always trying to address it. What if we do something different? What if we no longer look at it in this way, but we're looking at it a different way? But getting people to do that intentionally and stepping back takes a minute, right? It takes a minute for people to be willing to do that and then to go down that journey of what does it mean for us to really get to the root cause of the issue. Great question, Frank.
Such a great question. And it's a great reminder that if you are interested in having more conversations about this, how do we use systems tools? How do we start to think about systems in our work? Our contact information is in the app. Get in contact with us because we are working on getting some folks together to begin to have these conversations. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you. This question is another virtual question, and it says, can we identify all barriers and fix them one at a time?
I should take that one. So the challenge with trying to take them one at a time is that barriers usually don't exist in isolation. My transportation barrier affects my childcare. It affects my ability to get to work on time. And so my sense is that the one at a time method is how we are trying to go about it now. And in some cases, we might have something that's wildly successful, but it doesn't usually last, and it doesn't usually shift the system to create something healthier for people. So we have to think about instead the complexity of how do we support a family to do all the things that they need to do on a daily basis? How do they get to their kids to a school that's going to give them a really fantastic education? How do they take care of the food that they need for the week? How do they get to work and have a healthy and safe experience at work? And how do they pay their rent? All of those questions occur in a family together. And so we have to be able to think about them together.
I think it's challenging to do that though, right? It's challenging to do that because we're still thinking in the way that we always think. Here we have this pot of money, we have this funding. Here comes this RFP that says if we just do X, Y, and Z, we can get this funding, and we need this funding. Or that it's just hard to wrap our minds around it because it's just so complex. Like Jerica said, we all do complex things every day. We had to get to this conference, right? We had to do different things to do that. And we do those things, but now we're talking about doing it in it with a system, with people, with a group of people, and not just our personal selves. So how do we expand that thinking? Again, going back to learning system thinking and also practicing it.
And seeking out those solutions and examples that are out there and learning from them. I mean, we know organizations that are really good at this. We know coalitions that exist. We know community centers that are centered on people and that are working to support people in all of that complexity. So what are they doing right? What are they doing well? How do we learn from that and then start to build on that solution?
Thank you. Are there any other questions inside the room? All right. All right.
Yeah, Yeah, so we wanted to hear from you guys. Just take a few minutes and have a discussion. So
Oh, so we wanted to hear what resonated with you from this discussion, and where do you see the opportunity to bring one or more of the concepts that we shared into your work? So what resonated with you from the discussion, and where do you see opportunity?
Hi. Um, for me personally, I feel like I've been in a space where I've been trying to pinpoint like where I feel called to. Um, so I finished my undergrad like almost 3 years ago, like 2.5 years ago. I'm 25 and I'm like, finding where I'm passionate. I was gonna go to law school and I decided I was studying for my LSATs and I'm like, this is like not the direction I want to go. And so I've been like sitting still and like learning and growing and gaining skills. And I'm just like, okay, well, that is what draws me. And I really love working with like foster care and like kids aging out of foster care. And so thinking about all these multiple parts of the system kind of is stressful, especially when you see like a gap, right? And when there's not like a lot being tended to that specific gap, it seems like a very big task to take on or even a direction to pursue. And so I think just breaking down multiple parts of it and understanding, like being a case manager right now, where we work with people who have multiple issues that we're addressing, um, taking that lens of the systems that are within the systems and where to start. I think this is good for me to start thinking about where to start, right? I'm like, do I go back to school? Do I do these different things? Like the quote about, oh, do I need X degree to do certain things? Or do I just need to take a master class? Or just the ways to just continue to improve yourself. I'm like, I'm like thinking about my age and like what my goals are in the next coming years. And so thinking about how to tackle that has been task. So just looking at this and talking through it was good for me. So yeah.
Thank you. Go to you.
Hi. I found it interesting when you were discussing about the agencies and the funders and playing each other against each other in order to receive those funds. How do you see that changing? I mean, because I think me coming from years ago of doing grant writing when I was with the Alliance for Children and Families, we found that to be in a concern then when we were working, trying to get funds for a school-based program. So then that meant other agencies that were also trying to get that funding to sustain the program that we were implementing for them was a challenge. And because we would be the one disseminating the funds, of course, we needed the larger dollars to even assist our agencies to be able to put on that program. Do you see that changing in the future, or, any ideas for funders, as I mean, for us as people fighting for the dollars to still stay cohesive and collaborate and not let that happen?
Well, I'll start. So first I need to talk to you because if you work for Alliance, I want to know if you're back. But secondly, what I'm seeing is that that funders are seeing that that their funding dollars would go further with collective impact. So you have a lot more collective impact initiatives happening across the country. And funders are also, as I said before, being made aware of, given the last 20 months, of how the glaring issues in health, the glaring issues around systemic racism, that they need to make changes on how they're going to be able to fund people and what does it mean to really make a difference in communities. So I can see them shifting. If you look into different articles that philanthropy is putting out, they're having to shift their mindsets, their mental models about how do things really work and how do we actually affect change and how much money do we have to actually put into it. just something that I read before recently was that a funder talked about how if, there's requirements that funders put on providers as far as putting together all this reporting and detailing. So one funder said, okay, we will pay for someone to do that reporting for you. Not that the program director has to do all of it, because it takes a lot of time. So people are rethinking how they're funding. Is it spotty right now? Yeah, but I think that the funding community is rethinking all that. We also have a lot more people of color and people who actually lived in the community that have now been able to be part of the funding system in different ways. And they bring their knowledge and their lived experiences to this and say, hey, we need to do this differently. This is what happened. So I'm seeing those shifts and change. Love to see more. Love that there's more dollars out there, but I'm seeing some of it.
I completely agree with everything. The only thing that I will add is that it feels like we're in this space of opportunity right now because so many of them tried it differently during COVID and were successful. We saw collaboration on unprecedented levels. We saw dollars going to Black-led organizations in unprecedented levels. We saw the window of time to get dollars out the door shrink dramatically. So they know it's possible. We know it's possible. What can we do to cement some of this positive change rather than, once the emergency's over, allowing things to drift back to the way they were, because that was how it was comfortable. Can we be advocates in that space? But yeah, pockets, but there's a long way to go.
Does anyone else have a question?
So what I've been trying to see, and I guess what has stuck with me more so throughout all of this is the change is now coming from the people that are at the lower positions, because we deal with that. I don't know, is there any advice to try to get the people that are higher up to actually see those things and to try to push changes and different systems? Thank you.
Yeah, so there's different ways that we've seen organizations do that. It's having that maybe encouraging participants to be able to share with their program directors and with even the leaders of the organizations and say, here's my lived experiences. I need to be part of this process. That's a lot of risk on their part to do that. That's a lot of weight on them to do it, but also having staff do as well to support and elevate that wherever they can. There's also the pressure if there's different advisory councils or different community councils, different areas that may have community participants and also community leaders saying, here's what we need to talk to the agency, to talk to those in charge or leading, saying, we need to have this in a different way. You need to hear our voices. But you're right, it's hard to do that. There needs to be a mental model shift for those leaders, right? There needs to be a way for them to think differently. And so the other thing is that other leaders can connect with other leaders and say, here's how we've done things, and be able to provide that network. But it is difficult when you're starting at that point, making something a groundswell through the organization.
We talk about this a lot when we talk about how to help folks start pushing their organization to adopt equity, diversity, and inclusion in a serious way. And one of the main recommendations that we have is, if you're in this space where there are grassroots and singular voices, what can you do to start to create a network of allies? Can you find that one person in authority role who will be your champion and take that cause to their peers? Can you hold informal learning opportunities? Can you invite people to start that journey to learn more about what this looks like. And then that puts you in a space to build towards that tipping point where you can get to the folks who are able to say, oh, you know what, we're going to do something about this.
Yeah, to that point, you just made me think of something, that finding those champions, whether it's about looking at it from a systems viewpoint or looking at systemic racism, takes some time. So, but the reality is that when you begin to have the conversations, the informal conversations, there are many people who are thinking the same way that you are, but they don't know that they are. They don't know who else in the organization is thinking that way. And so being able to be that connector, that person that has the conversations, that builds relationships, that you can be hear other people's voices and be able to connect people together. It's going to take some time and some intention on your part. I've done that work in the past, and it does take time, but it does reveal something. And once people realize, oh, I'm not the only one in this building or the only one in this organization who thinks that way, there's other people, they will start to connect with each other.
That's such a great point. Yeah.
All right, guys, that concludes our question and answer session. Jerica and Phyllis, we would love to thank you on behalf of SDC for this very informative discussion. We appreciate you because definitely this is something that is going on in our community. We have so many people in our community that have tons of ideas, but just don't know how to display them or get their ideas out. So with the discussion that we've had with you, we actually gain tools on how to go about doing that and get our ideas out there, because everyone idea counts. So again, thank you on behalf of SDC.